I was setting up my classroom for the annual college fair when Superintendent Dr. Margaret Whitfield walked in with 3 school board members I'd never seen before. The smell of fresh markers and laminated college brochures filled the air as I arranged information tables from Harvard, Yale, Stanford, and dozens of other universities across my classroom floor. "This is our urban program," Dr. Whitfield said, her voice carrying that particular tone administrators use when they're trying to sound progressive while saying something entirely different. The 3 board members, all wearing expensive suits that probably cost more than my monthly salary, looked around my classroom at Martin Luther King Jr. High School with barely concealed disdain. Their eyes swept over the college acceptance letters I'd taped to the walls, the scholarship announcements pinned to the bulletin board, and the photos of former students in graduation caps and medical school white coats. "How optimistic," said the tallest board member, a silver-haired man whose name tag read Robert Lancaster III. He picked up a Harvard Medical School brochure from my desk, examining it like it was written in hieroglyphics. I'd been teaching American history at King High for 18 years, and I thought I'd heard every variation of educational elitism. But what happened next would shatter my faith in the system I'd devoted my life to serving. "Dr. Whitfield," Lancaster said, setting down the brochure with obvious distaste, "let's be realistic about resource allocation here." The words that came out of his mouth next would echo in my nightmares for months. Words that would ignite a fire in me that burned for 7 years. Words that would ultimately become the most expensive mistake the school district ever made. Because in 7 years, 15 of my ghetto trash students would be practicing physicians, and I'd have the receipts to prove it. Let me paint you the full picture of Martin Luther King Jr. High School. I'm Marcus Washington, and I've been teaching here since 2006, when I was 25 years old, with a master's in history education and dreams of proving that zip code doesn't determine destiny. King High sits in the heart of East Cleveland, a neighborhood where 92% of our 2,000 students qualify for free lunch. Our building is a red brick fortress from the 1960s, with windows covered in security mesh and hallways that echo with the sound of metal detectors every morning. The paint peels in the stairwells, the heating system breaks down every winter, and half our textbooks still call it the Soviet Union instead of Russia. But inside those cracked walls, something magical was happening in room 217. My classroom had become a college preparation center disguised as a history class. While other teachers focused on keeping students quiet and getting through standardized test prep, I was teaching my kids about the GI Bill, the Civil Rights Movement, and how education had been used throughout history as both a weapon of oppression and a tool of liberation. The walls of my classroom told a different story than the statistics. College acceptance letters from Harvard, Yale, Stanford, Spelman, Morehouse, and Howard University. Scholarship announcements totaling over $3 million in financial aid awarded to my former students. Photos of graduates in cap and gown, holding diplomas from medical schools, law schools, and graduate programs across the country. 3 months before this devastating encounter, I'd received news that should have made district headlines. Maria Santos, who'd been my student 5 years earlier, had just been accepted to Johns Hopkins Medical School with a full scholarship. She was the 8th former student of mine to get into medical school, joining a growing list that included pediatricians, emergency medicine physicians, and surgeons who'd started their journey in my American history class. Maria had grown up in a housing project 6 blocks from school, raised by a grandmother who cleaned office buildings at night. When she first walked into my classroom as a sophomore, she was failing 3 classes and convinced she was too dumb for college. By graduation, she was valedictorian with a 4.0 GPA and acceptance letters from 12 universities. The local newspaper had run a small story about her success, buried on page 7 between high school sports scores and a recipe for apple pie. The district newsletter hadn't mentioned it at all. But in my classroom, Maria's acceptance letter was framed like the Mona Lisa, inspiring every student who walked through my door. This was the environment, the culture of excellence and high expectations that Dr. Whitfield was showcasing to the school board that October afternoon, or so I thought. The truth was, King High had been systematically underfunded and underestimated for years. While suburban schools in our district received new technology, updated textbooks, and college counselors, we got broken promises and budget cuts disguised as restructuring initiatives. Our guidance counselor, Mrs. Robinson, was responsible for 800 students. She spent most of her time dealing with crisis interventions and had exactly 17 minutes per student per year for college planning. Our library hadn't purchased a new book since 2012, and our computer lab was filled with machines that took 15 minutes to boot up and crashed whenever more than 10 students tried to use the internet simultaneously. Despite these obstacles, I'd created something special. Every August, I required my students to research a historical figure who'd overcome adversity to achieve success. But instead of just writing reports, they had to connect those stories to their own lives and create detailed plans for their future careers. Frederick Douglass led to discussions about the power of literacy. Harriet Tubman sparked conversations about courage and determination. Dr. Martin Luther King Jr. inspired essays about education as a form of social justice. And always, I connected these historical lessons to modern possibilities. If Thurgood Marshall could go from Baltimore to the Supreme Court, I'd tell my students, then you can go from East Cleveland to medical school. The obstacles are different, but the determination required is the same. I'd developed relationships with alumni who'd graduated from prestigious universities. Dr. Jennifer Williams, class of 2010, now practicing emergency medicine in Chicago, came back every year to speak to my classes. Attorney David Johnson, class of 2012, mentored current students through college applications. Dr. Michelle Parker, class of 2014, had established a scholarship fund specifically for King High graduates pursuing careers in medicine. But to the district administration, these success stories were anomalies, not evidence of systemic potential. When budget meetings discussed resource allocation, King High was always presented as a challenging environment where realistic expectations were more important than ambitious goals. I'd sit in faculty meetings listening to administrators talk about our students like they were broken beyond repair, like their potential was limited by their circumstances, like college preparation was a waste of time and resources better spent on practical skills and alternative pathways. The pattern was clear: low expectations leading to low investment, leading to predictable outcomes. But my classroom was proving that pattern wrong, one student at a time. Back to that October afternoon with Dr. Whitfield leading her tour of board members through my classroom like visitors at a zoo. The three men in expensive suits were examining my college fair setup with the kind of detached curiosity usually reserved for anthropological expeditions. Mr. Washington has created quite an aspirational environment, Dr. Whitfield said, her voice dripping with condescension. The students seemed to respond well to positive reinforcement. I was arranging Princeton University brochures when Robert Lancaster III picked up an application to Harvard Medical School from my desk, his eyebrows raised as he read the requirements. "Medical school?" he asked, looking at me like I'd just suggested my students apply to become astronauts. "For students from here?" "Yes, sir," I replied, maintaining my professional composure despite the growing tension in my chest. "I have 8 former students currently in medical school, with 3 more applying this year." The second board member, a woman whose name tag read Patricia Thornton, actually laughed, as she looked at the wall of college acceptance letters. "How wonderfully optimistic," she said, the word optimistic pronounced like it tasted bitter in her mouth. "But perhaps we should focus on more attainable goals for this demographic." "This demographic?" I repeated, feeling my professional mask beginning to slip. "Well, you know," Lancaster said, gesturing vaguely at the windows that overlooked the neighborhood where my students lived. "Given the socioeconomic challenges, the family structures, the cultural barriers." "What exactly are you saying?" I asked, setting down the brochures with hands that had started to tremble slightly. Dr. Whitfield stepped forward, clearly uncomfortable with the direction of the conversation. "What Mr. Lancaster means is that we need to be realistic about outcomes and allocate resources accordingly." "Realistic," Lancaster said, his voice gaining confidence as he warmed to his theme. "Look, Mr. Washington, I admire your enthusiasm, but let's be honest about what we're dealing with here." He gestured at my classroom walls, at the photos of successful graduates, at the college fair setup I'd spent weeks organizing. Your students are ghetto trash who will never amount to anything more than welfare recipients and criminals. This whole college preparation charade is a waste of taxpayer money that could be better spent on vocational training and basic life skills. The words hit me like physical blows. Ghetto trash. The phrase hung in the air like smoke from a house fire, poisoning everything it touched. Patricia Thornton nodded in agreement. We need to prepare these children for the jobs they're actually going to get. Custodial work, food service, manual labor, that's their reality. Medical school? Lancaster continued, his voice rising with indignation. Harvard? Yale? Come on, these kids can barely read at grade level. Half of them will drop out before graduation. The ones who do graduate will be lucky to get community college certificates. I looked at Dr. Whitfield, waiting for her to defend her students, to challenge these assumptions, to stand up for the teenagers who trusted her with their education and their futures. Instead, she nodded slowly. Resource allocation has to be data-driven, she said quietly. We have to work within realistic parameters. Ghetto trash. The words echoed in my head as I stared at these three people who held the power to shape educational policy for thousands of students. These were the people making decisions about funding, about programs, about the opportunities that would or wouldn't be available to kids who were already fighting uphill battles every single day. Standing there in my classroom, surrounded by evidence of my students' potential and achievements, I realized that the biggest obstacle my kids faced wasn't poverty or broken families or neighborhood violence. It was these people, the ones who'd already decided that my students' lives didn't matter, that their dreams weren't worth investing in, that their futures were predetermined by their zip code. That night, I sat in my living room grading essays about courage throughout American history, but I couldn't focus on the words in front of me. My students had written about Rosa Parks, about Jackie Robinson, about ordinary people who'd refused to accept the limitations others had placed on them. Deshaun Williams had written about Langston Hughes, connecting the poet's dreams deferred to his own aspirations of becoming a surgeon. History shows us that somebody's always telling us what we can't do, he'd written, but history also shows us what happens when we don't listen. Destiny Crawford had analyzed the civil rights movement through the lens of educational access, writing about how her grandmother had been denied the right to attend white schools and how she planned to honor that sacrifice by becoming the first doctor in her family. Malik Thompson, whose father was serving a 10-year sentence for drug dealing, had written about the power of education to break cycles of poverty and incarceration. His essay ended with these words: Mr. Washington always says that education is the great equalizer. I want to prove that being born in the hood doesn't mean you have to die in the hood. Ghetto trash. How could anyone look at these remarkable young people, at their intelligence, their determination, their hopes for the future, and see nothing but waste and failure? I thought about Maria Santos, now thriving at Johns Hopkins, about Dr. Jennifer Williams saving lives in Chicago emergency rooms, about David Johnson fighting for justice in courtrooms across the country. These weren't exceptions to some rule about urban education. They were proof of what was possible when someone believed in students enough to set high expectations and provide the support to meet them. But Lancaster, Thornton, and even Dr. Whitfield saw only stereotypes and statistics. They saw my students' addresses, not their potential. They saw demographic data, not individual brilliance. They saw budget line items, not human beings deserving of investment and opportunity. The more I thought about it, the angrier I became. Not just angry, furious. Furious at a system that had written off my kids before giving them a chance. Furious at administrators who spoke about realistic expectations, like they were being compassionate instead of cruel. Furious at board members who made decisions about students they'd never bothered to know. Underneath the anger was something else. Determination. A resolve that burned like a flame that couldn't be extinguished. They wanted to see ghetto trash? Fine. I'd show them exactly what ghetto trash could accomplish when given the chance. The next morning, I arrived at school with a mission that would consume the next 7 years of my life. I was going to document everything, Every success, every achievement, every moment when my students proved the doubters wrong. I started with a simple spreadsheet: student names, graduation years, college acceptances, career paths, current status. What began as a way to track former students became a comprehensive database of success stories that challenged every assumption the school board had made. But I needed more than anecdotal evidence. I needed systematic proof that high expectations and proper support could produce extraordinary results, especially in an urban environment. I partnered with Dr. Michelle Parker, my former student who'd established the scholarship fund, to create a formal mentoring program connecting current students with successful alumni. Every month, we held Dream Big sessions where graduates shared their journeys from King High to professional success. Dr. Jennifer Williams started a pre-med club that met every Saturday morning in my classroom. Students learned about MCAT preparation, medical school application processes, and scholarship opportunities. They practiced interviews, wrote personal statements, and connected with physicians who'd once sat in the same desks where they were sitting. I reached out to colleges and universities, building relationships with admissions counselors who specialized in first-generation college students. I learned about summer programs, enrichment opportunities, and scholarship competitions that could give my students advantages typically reserved for students from wealthy suburban districts. Most importantly, I started documenting everything with the precision of a historian building a case. Every college acceptance letter was photocopied and filed. Every scholarship award was recorded and tracked. Every success story was documented with photographs, news clippings, and detailed records of the student's journey from freshman year to professional achievement. I created a wall of fame in my classroom that grew larger every year, not just college acceptances, but graduate school admissions, professional school placements, career achievements, and life milestones. Every student who walked into my room could see concrete evidence that their dreams were not only possible but probable if they were willing to work for them. The message was clear: we weren't just going to prove Lancaster and Thornton wrong, we were going to prove them so wrong that their ignorance would become a public embarrassment. But I needed time. Real success, the kind that would shut down their arguments permanently, would take years to develop. Medical school alone was 4 years after college, which meant some of my current students wouldn't be practicing physicians until they were in their late 20s. I was playing a long game, but I was playing to win. 7 years after that devastating encounter in my classroom, I received an email that made my hands shake with excitement. Deshaun Williams, the student who'd written about Langston Hughes and deferred dreams, had just completed his residency in pediatric surgery at Children's Hospital of Philadelphia. He was the 15th former student of mine to become a practicing physician. The timing was perfect. The school board was scheduled to vote on budget allocations for the next fiscal year, and King High was once again on the chopping block for program cuts. The same 3 board members who'd visited my classroom 7 years earlier were still in power, still making decisions based on the same prejudices and low expectations. I spent 2 weeks preparing for what I privately called the reckoning. I contacted every former student who'd achieved professional success, gathering updated information about their careers, their contributions to their communities, and their ongoing connections to King High. The data was staggering. Over the past 7 years, my former students 15 had become practicing physicians, 12 had become attorneys, 8 had become engineers, 6 had become teachers, 4 had become nurses, 3 had become dentists, 2 had become veterinarians, and 27 others had completed graduate degrees in fields ranging from psychology to business administration to social work. Collectively, they'd earned over $12 million in scholarships and financial aid. They were working in hospitals, law firms, engineering companies, and schools across the country. They were saving lives, fighting for justice, building bridges, and educating the next generation. But more than statistics, I had stories. Real stories about real people who'd overcome incredible obstacles to achieve extraordinary success. The school board meeting was held in the same conference room where I'd faced budget cuts and program eliminations for 7 years. The same wood-paneled walls, the same fluorescent lighting, the same atmosphere of bureaucratic indifference. But this time, I wasn't alone. Dr. Deshaun Williams flew in from Philadelphia, Dr. Jennifer Williams drove down from Chicago, Attorney David Johnson took time off from his practice in Atlanta, Dr. Michelle Parker closed her clinic for the day. 15 successful professionals who'd graduated from Martin Luther King Jr. High school filled the public seating area wearing the white coats, business suits, and professional attire that announced their achievements to anyone paying attention. When my turn came to speak, I walked to the podium with 7 years of documented evidence and 15 living examples of what ghetto trash could accomplish when given the opportunity. 7 years ago, I began, my voice steady despite my racing heart. 3 members of this board visited my classroom during a college fair. Mr. Lancaster, Miss Thornton, and Dr. Whitfield expressed concerns about resource allocation and realistic expectations for our students. I clicked to my first PowerPoint slide, showing photos of my classroom from that October day 7 years earlier. Specifically, Mr. Lancaster stated that my students were ghetto trash who would never amount to anything more than welfare recipients and criminals. He suggested that college preparation was a waste of taxpayer money that should be redirected to vocational training and basic life skills. The room had gone completely silent. Even the board members who hadn't been present for the original incident were leaning forward, sensing that something significant was about to unfold. I'd like to introduce you to some of that ghetto trash. Dr. Deshaun Williams stood up, his pediatric surgery scrubs visible under his suit jacket. Deshaun Williams, class of 2016. I just completed my residency in pediatric surgery at Children's Hospital of Philadelphia. Last month, I performed a life-saving operation on a 6-year-old girl with a rare cardiac defect. Mr. Washington's history class taught me that impossible things become possible when people refuse to accept limitations. One by one, my former students stood and introduced themselves. Each name was accompanied by achievements that would have been impressive for students from any background, but were absolutely extraordinary for kids who'd been written off as ghetto trash. Dr. Jennifer Williams, emergency medicine physician, Chicago Memorial Hospital. I've saved over 300 lives in the past 5 years. Attorney David Johnson, partner at Johnson, Williams & Associates. I specialize in civil rights law and have won over $2 million in settlements for victims of discrimination. Dr. Michelle Parker, internal medicine physician and founder of the East Cleveland Community Health Center, which provides free medical care to uninsured residents. For 45 minutes, I presented 7 years of documentation proving that high expectations and proper support could produce extraordinary results from students everyone else had dismissed as hopeless. But the most powerful moment came when I clicked to my final slide, a group photo of all 15 doctors who'd graduated from my classes, wearing their white coats and holding diplomas from Harvard, Yale, Johns Hopkins, Duke, Stanford, and other prestigious medical schools. Mr. Lancaster, I said, looking directly at the man who'd uttered those devastating words 7 years earlier. You said my students were ghetto trash who would never amount to anything. I'd like you to meet 15 practicing physicians who would respectfully disagree with your assessment. The room erupted in applause that lasted for over 3 minutes. Board members who'd spent years voting for budget cuts were wiping tears from their eyes. Parents and community members were standing and cheering for students who'd proven that zip code doesn't determine destiny. The board voted unanimously to not only restore full funding to King High's college preparation programs, but to expand them district-wide. They approved a $5 million investment in college counseling, test preparation, and scholarship support for all students in the district's urban schools. But the real victory wasn't the money. It was the transformation in how people saw our students and their potential. 6 months later, Robert Lancaster III resigned from the school board, citing philosophical differences with the district's educational priorities. Patricia Thornton followed suit 3 months after that. Dr. Whitfield announced her retirement and was replaced by Dr. Michael Rodriguez, a former teacher who'd spent 15 years working in urban schools before moving into administration. The changes at King High were immediate and dramatic. College representatives who'd never visited our campus before started scheduling regular information sessions. Scholarship organizations that had overlooked our students began actively recruiting from our school. Universities that had considered us a non-traditional pipeline suddenly recognized us as a source of exceptional talent. But the most satisfying change was cultural. The narrative about our students shifted from deficit-based thinking to asset-based recognition. Instead of talking about what our kids lacked, educators and administrators started focusing on their strengths, their potential, and their remarkable ability to succeed when given appropriate support and high expectations. My classroom became a model that was replicated in other urban schools throughout the district. The Dream Big mentoring program was expanded to include partnerships with law firms, engineering companies, and medical practices. The Wall of Fame concept was adopted by teachers across the district who wanted to showcase their students' achievements. 3 years after The Reckoning, King High was featured on the cover of Education Week magazine as an example of how high expectations and strong support systems could transform outcomes for students in challenging environments. The article included interviews with my former students who are now practicing physicians, successful attorneys, and community leaders making a difference in cities across the country. Deshaun Williams was quoted in the article. People always ask me how I went from the hood to Harvard Medical School. The answer is simple. I had a teacher who refused to accept limitations that other people tried to place on me. Mr. Washington taught me that history is full of people who were told they couldn't succeed, and history is also full of proof that those people were wrong. Today, 23 former students of mine are practicing physicians. 18 are attorneys fighting for justice in courtrooms across the country. Dozens more are teachers, engineers, business owners, and community leaders who've used their education to create positive change in their communities and beyond. The scholarship fund established by Dr. Michelle Parker has grown to over $2 million, providing college support for hundreds of students who might otherwise have been unable to afford higher education. The mentoring program connects current students with successful alumni who serve as living proof that dreams deferred don't have to become dreams denied. But the real measure of success isn't in the statistics or the headlines or even the medical degrees hanging on walls across America. It's in the transformation of how an entire community sees itself and its children. Where once there were low expectations and limited opportunities, there are now college preparation programs, advanced placement courses, and partnerships with prestigious universities. Where once there were deficit-based narratives about urban students, there are now strength-based approaches that recognize and nurture potential. Most importantly, where once there were adults who looked at brilliant young people and saw only ghetto trash, there are now educators and leaders who see doctors, lawyers, teachers, engineers, and changemakers waiting to emerge. If you're an educator working with students who've been written off by others, I want you to know that your belief in their potential can literally change the trajectory of their lives. High expectations aren't cruel when they're accompanied by high support. Dreams aren't unrealistic when they're backed up by detailed plans and comprehensive assistance. Document everything. Celebrate every success. Connect your students with people who've walked similar paths and achieved extraordinary things. Build partnerships with colleges and universities that understand the value of diverse perspectives and experiences. Create visual reminders that success is possible, probable, and happening right in your classroom. And if anyone tells you that your students' dreams are unrealistic, that their goals are too ambitious, that their backgrounds make success impossible, remember this. They said the same thing about 15 young people who are now saving lives in hospitals across America. Because sometimes the students that others call ghetto trash become the doctors who save their children's lives, the lawyers who fight for their rights, and the teachers who educate the next generation with the wisdom that comes from overcoming obstacles that seemed insurmountable. Sometimes the kids that society writes off become the adults that society can't function without. And sometimes proving the doubters wrong takes 7 years, but the wait is worth every single moment when you get to watch your former students walk across graduation stages, take medical school oaths, and change the world, one patient, one case, one student at a time. The only trash in this story was the low expectations that tried to limit unlimited potential. My students proved that diamonds can emerge from any environment when someone believes they're worth polishing.